Presentation, we will be measuring well-being. In order to achieve this, we will be using Gross Domestic Product and Human Development Index as respective indicators for the numerical aspects of our investigations, as well as a few closed derivative indexes that will be described in due time.
In order to analyze how GDP can be an indicator for material well-being, we first analyzed the final consumption and how it varies between countries. Final consumption is government expenditures in healthcare, education, and so on. While studying the data, we saw that among 212 countries, 179 countries have data among the entire period. Instead, 33 countries have missing data. In this case, we can see how Armenia, Ukraine, and Sudan have missing data. This is because they probably do not have the resources to collect it. We do not think it is a problem, the missing data, in order to analyze the trend of financial consumption. However, for countries like Sudan that have missing data and they only have 11 years of collected data, it can be an issue. Sudan has experienced 2 civil wars, and that's the reason why they lack in data. And in order to understand the country's expenditure for material well-being and the citizen happiness and well-being, it could be a problem. Then we analyze the GDP as whole, considering the household expenditure, the final consumption, the gross capital formation, and the net exports. Before analyzing it as whole, we had to look into the net exports, and we studied 2 countries. We studied Albania and Spain. In Albania, we see that since 1990, Albania has a trade deficit, meaning imports bigger than exports. This is due to the fall of communism that increased the demand in foreign goods. Moreover, for Albania, since 1997 to 2018, the country is still improving its economy after the fall of communism. That's why we have a persisting trade deficit. For Spain, instead, we have, as we can see, a trade deficit starting from the years 2000 because of the foreign investments caused a housing bubble, which then led to the financial crisis. Step number 2 was to analyze the correlation among the GDP components. We thought that final consumption, government expenditure, and gross capital would move together, while net exports move opposite. This is because if government increase its expenditures, the output will increase. Therefore, consumption will increase and investment will increase. However, there will be more imports than exports. Therefore, there will be a trade deficit. This is why net export moves opposite. We can see the correlation, especially for Albania. Since 1990, the fall of communism, the 3 components have been moving together, while net export have been moving opposite. Instead, for Spain, we could see that they're moving more or less together. This is because of the restrictions of the EU, which appear as an artificial cap or restraint for the slope curve. However, net exports will always move opposite. This is more as a restraint for Spain than for Albania, because Albania entered the EU only in 2009.
Another way to use gross domestic product is to consider the 4 components of GDP as a proportion of GDP. We have divided the countries into developed, in an economic transition, or developing. Firstly, the developed countries for which we have calculated each component as a proportion of GDP for 2015 are the United States, Spain, and Austria. The relationship between these countries is homogeneous. Household consumption expenditure is between a range of 0.53 and 0.67, a general government final consumption between 0.40 and 0.20, and a gross capital formation between 0.50 and 0.25. Finally, net exports between a range of minus 0.03 and 0.04, with the US being the only country with a trade deficit. The countries in economic transition that were chosen are Ukraine, Albania, and Serbia. These countries have different data with household consumption between a range of 0.68 to 0.81. On the other hand, the government final consumption ranges between 0.11 and 0.19 in Serbia and Albania. The gross capital formation is 0.19 and 0.26. The net exports have a range between minus 0.03 and minus 0.17, which shows that these countries were facing a trade deficit. Finally, the developing countries picked are India, China, and Morocco. India and Morocco have very similar data. The household consumption expenditure is around 58 to 59%, government expenditure of around 10 to 29%, a gross capital formation of around 31 to 32%, and finally, the net exports, which can vary from minus 2% to minus 8%, indicating a trade deficit. However, it has comparatively lower household consumption of a 39%, and why with government spending of 40%, but significantly higher gross capital formation of 46% and a trade surplus with 3% in net exports. In the graph you can see a more clear visualization of the data just stated. It is clear that the countries that are in economic transition are clearly homogeneous, among them with a negative value in net exports.
The above data sets for GDP and calculating the proportion of GDP demonstrate the ease of calculation and comparison between countries and a single country's trend. GDP per capita is an indicator of the total income generated by economic activity in a country, which is often used as a measure of people's material well-being. As the Harvard Business Review article states, many statisticians prefer GDP because the values given are not estimated and fairly easy to quantify, as we have seen. In some cases, the data and analysis seem to correlate. In the case of Albania, after a period of economic pain after the fall of communism and its negative impact on material well-being, the free economy has allowed for a marked increase in consumption, investment, and government spending as seen by the sharper slopes after the Civil War of 1997. So the material well-being has been improved at a higher rate. Moreover, unlike Spain, there is no noticeable impact of the 2008 financial crisis of those GDP factors in Albania on net exports. But these two countries show the difficulties of comparing two countries with very different economic dynamics. Looking at the proportion of GDP gives us additional insights. Among the countries chosen, it can be seen that the consumption levels for developing countries are similar to each and perhaps almost closer to the United States. One might think that material well-being is the same as a developed country. However, these proportions do not take into account the quality of health, education, externalities, leisure, or production. Moreover, it does not consider sustainability or the consumption of natural resources in its calculations. We believe that is an appropriate measure of material well-being, but not overall well-being. GDP is quantifiable and measurable. It is a good index to apply to determine material well-being because the latter is more easily quantifiable compared to non-material well-being. Adjustments can always be made to individual elements in the GDP to have it align with material well-being. Overall well-being includes factors beyond material well-being, such as quality of health, education, leisure, life expectancy, and so on. Here, there is not the difficulty in trying to measure these factors, but also to determine the appropriate baseline that is acceptable to all individuals, since these elements could have different and varying values for each person. But alternative indexes for non-material and overall well-being are growing credibility in important circles and economic policy.
Now we're going to talk a little bit about the work carried out on measuring well-being as a non-material issue. So the first step here was to gain a certain understanding of the index we were trying to measure. So first presented with the data set on UNDP, we saw how the theoretical dimensionality of the measures is numerically translated with the usual health, education, and income columns. It is interesting to notice how the choice of these factors de facto determines the definition of well-being in this given framework. As a composite index, HDI and its three sub-indexes are calculated using strict formulas. It is sensible to point out here that the UNDP operated a shift in 2010 in the choice of the metrics to evaluate the country's performance in each of these three areas. One of the big differences being the adjustment from GDP to income in measuring the living of standards, as actual income was deemed more relevant to measuring economic welfare for the resident of a given country. In a similar attempt to evaluate and challenge the relevance of the given indicators, the exercise prompted us to come up with an alternative HDI based on the same three dimensions but numerically formed using new factors of our choice for which maximum and minimum values for the computations were to be determined. An interesting feature of that exercise was the non-inclusion of income in the formation of the index, further emphasizing well-being as a non-material issue. Another key highlight was the importance given to rankings and classifications, whether geographically or in terms of development. It is easy to understand why ranks are given such a predominant role, to show, for instance, how a ranking can be used to name and shame countries into trying to do better, with a quite literal representation of the idea in the least developed countries cluster. Compared to GDP, HDI has a greater emphasis on human development. It takes the quality of life into account, not just the production capacity of a country. Education and health are considered as important to a country as economical power. GDP is considered a means to human development, but not an end. GNI per capita, which is essentially the average person's purchasing power, is an important factor in calculating HDI, but just one of several. HDI paints a more holistic picture of a country than GDP, and cases of countries with the same GDPs but with vastly different HDIs are not uncommon. But still, we can observe a strong positive correlation between GDP per capita and HDI. We can explain that by stating the causal relationship between economic growth and human development as a mutually influential relationship. Economic growth makes it possible to reach high levels of human development, and increasing levels of human development in turn lead to increased opportunities for economic growth. Yet, despite that, HDI still happens to be the most widespread measure of human welfare, and it is coherent when we look at its advantages, as it allows us to compare countries and regions, study patterns over time, and as a composite index, it has a more comprehensive picture of the question on human welfare.